Welcome to Psychology of Pilgrimage. In this episode, I'm joined by Aaron Heft, a military historian that is currently working for the U.S. Army Center of Military History. It's so nice to see you, Aaron, and to have the opportunity to talk to you about Fismes and Fismette, which are places that you have strong connections to. I was able to visit Fismes and Fismette back in October of 2024, based on your work and on discussions with you about these two towns. Up to this point, they were fairly unfamiliar to me, and I was so glad that I made it to the museum that is run by your friends Robin and his father Lauren. And the museum in and of itself is an impressive place to visit. I would argue, and probably you will be able to argue also, that it's its own pilgrimage site, and I hope that we'll be able to talk about that. And the community itself is a charming, small community where the impact of war is really felt in terms of the monuments to the French people who were from the area, as well as to the Americans who died in the process of liberating the town. And the sacrifices are quite significant in terms of American casualties in this area. So I'd love to hear more about all of this as we talk today. And I'd like to start with you sharing a story about a pilgrimage artifact that you have brought back from one of your pilgrimages.
Sure. I'm absolutely honored to be here. This has really been something I've been looking forward to. So, to kick us off, the artifact, and I debated for a long time. I had a lot of theme artifacts that I was torn between. So with a little advice from our friend Jonathan Bratton, I selected this one. So it may be a little hard to see with the glare, but in this little frame is a poppy that was growing on the street in Fismette that I picked and preserved in 2022 on one of my personal pilgrimages to Fismes. To me, I was walking down the street corner. I was carrying a copy of Hervey Allen's memoir, Towards the Flame, which, covers his experience fighting in Fismes and Fismette. And as I rounded the corner, I saw a small cluster of poppies growing from the base of kind of like a stone wall that was there, which plays a significant role in the battle. And for me, the poppy, the connection to World War I and the veteran community stood out. So I plucked one, placed it inside Hervey Allen's book, and carried it back to the States. And I think what struck me so much about this is that was a personal connection to me and World War I and the tie into this town that means so much to me. And then, as we've talked about, I'm in the process of transcribing a diary of a pilgrim from the 112th Infantry, sister unit of mine in the Army. And closing in on the end of the diary, I flipped a page and found a poppy from Fismette that he had stuck in the back of his own diary from his pilgrimage in 1928. And I can share a photo of that later, but it was something that I found afterwards that, we talk a lot about practices when we study pilgrimage. And, I had inadvertently done something that members of my unit had done for, 100 years nearly. So that was a pretty important artifact to me.
I was hoping you were going to share that part of this. I was able to see the diary and this poppy when I was there in October. And as soon as you brought out the poppy that you had brought, I thought that you had picked up during your pilgrimage. It's uncanny, actually, the practices between two soldiers and veterans that both approach the same area, but 100 years apart, almost 100 years apart.
That's too, we only found that diary less than a year ago, so this predated it by several years, and it kind of just took me aback a little bit when I saw it, and almost the same writing on the page that I wrote on my when I
really
brought here. Yeah, it's very simple.
What did you write on your page?
Just Fismette and the year, and he wrote poppy from Fismette and the year. So it was just visually very striking to me that it was so close.
Yeah, and really a demonstration that the practices during pilgrimages also can connect people. It's not only the pilgrimage site, but it's actually the practices and what humans are drawn to in a particular area or context shows the enduring power of those practices. What is your connection, both professionally and personally, to these two towns in France?
Well, I mean, I think there's a couple angles here. So, as you know, one of my jobs in the Army was conducting what we refer to as staff rides. And staff rides, to be clear, are pilgrimages in a way, but they are very much a training event for soldiers. So what we do with a staff ride is we take soldiers to a physical battlefield. We study the tactics, the doctrine of the time period we're looking at. We discuss the leadership decisions that are made, and we look for this experience as inspiration as leaders today, to look for examples of how we could better improve our craft as soldiers. But part of that trip and staff rides, something that's very important is kind of connecting with the terrain and the locations we are, and you interact a lot with the people who live there. Now, the fighting at Fismes and Fismette, which we'll talk about a little bit later, it was urban warfare. It was urban warfare at a divisional corps level battle. This is large scale combat operations, as we call it today. So it is something that is very relevant to current soldiers. So I approached it professionally, studying the battle in a manner of, how can we educate soldiers to fight this way today and to learn from the mistakes and the successes of the fight in 1918. But also, Fismes for me is a very personal connection. My first unit in the Army, the 111th Infantry, this was the toughest experience of their fight in World War I. And from the start of my military career, literally the first day I walked into my unit when I reported back from basic training, I saw a photo of a member of our unit who had earned the Medal of Honor in the fighting at Fismes and Fismette. And so from that day one, I was connected and interested in the battle itself. And over the years, I've met many residents of Fismes and through Facebook and Instagram and things like that, I've communicated pretty extensively with some of the residents of the town. Robin and Laurent, as you mentioned, are two very close friends of mine now. And, we talk a lot about the town, the experience, the fighting, and kind of share our notes and our feelings on it.
Do you also have experience leading staff rides to this area? And what have those experiences been like?
Sure, yeah. So my very first OCONUS or outside of the United States staff ride that I ever conducted was conducted in 2019, just a year after the World War I centennial. And we took a group of soldiers from Pennsylvania, actually from my original unit. Several of the members were from that. I had since moved on and was working at headquarters in Washington. And, we got to go back to the town. And for me, this was a very important trip because it was my first time helping to lead one of these programs, taking soldiers around. There's a lot of stress with logistics and making sure you meet all the time requirements and what sort of material you're presenting, what sort of topics you're covering. But I got to take soldiers through Fismes and Fismette. And in addition to knowing the nitty-gritty tactical details that we wanted to talk about, for me, this was the first time I had ever physically set foot there. So it was very impactful for me to see it for the first time. And walking through these soldiers, I got to point out things that I had read about for years, plaques to their specific companies, 100-man units, a plaque to that unit on a wall on the side of the city hall, or a bridge that carried the symbols that they wore every day on their uniform. And walking through the town and teaching the experience of the soldiers, being so invested in the individuals who fought there, really helped draw out the important lessons for the soldiers that we took to the town. So that was my first time there, was 2019. And since 2019, I've taken five different groups of soldiers back to Fismes and Fismette specifically.
Is there a particular part of the town or monument or place on the bridge that is more impactful for you over and above other places?
Ooh, that's tough. I would say that the bridge itself is such a strong connection for the soldiers, and there's many reasons why that place stands out. it's erected, and we'll talk a little bit about that later on. It's erected by residents of Pennsylvania to remember the sacrifices there. So it's emblazoned with the state crest, the keystone insignia of the 28th Division, and it says, on it that it's dedicated to the men of the division. So that is very impactful to see a large structure like that dedicated to low-ranking individual soldiers. And then the crest itself, or the bridge itself, is present in a lot of imagery and heraldry of the Pennsylvania Guard. So if you've seen it on insignia and now you're seeing it in person, that can be very impactful. So to me, that is one of the most important places to take soldiers. But there's also in a back alley a stone wall that cuts through Fismette itself. And when you read the writing of a lot of the soldiers who fought there, that was almost their limit of advance, or the furthest that they made it during the heavy portions of the fighting in early August. And the stone wall is unchanged. You can run your hand down it and feel exactly what they were leaning up against while they sheltered from the adversaries and the machine guns and all of that. So that is a very impactful place to me, not just as a historian, but as a soldier. I can see the value of this position. I can look at the terrain and understand why they were pinned down here, and understand the decision-making processes that had to take place while looking for a way out of that position.
Been writing a bit about natural features that offer pilgrims something particular in an environment, and the wall that you're describing, yes, is a constructed it's a structure that was created by humans. It's not like the stones were just there, but the stones themselves are natural features. Can you say a little bit more about what the experience is like of touching this place where soldiers were in 1918, and what kind of happens from a sensory perspective when a person touches a natural element like a stone? It's the same stone or same set of stones that were there in 1918.
So for sure, there is. You can see a recreation, you can see a painting, you can see a photo, a movie. For a lot of soldiers, that's what they connect to warfare and World War I or World War II. And it'll give you an idea of what it was like, and it'll give you kind of something to picture in your head. But when you're physically there and you touch something that the soldiers who came before you had that same experience, they place their hand in the same spot, that really connects you deeper to the experience that they had. Even though there's none of the terror and the horror in it, when you're there, that they were in that same place. And that can really help, I think, form a kind of core memory that helps you remember the rest of the reason you're there. So if we're there for a training purpose, touching that stone wall and feeling that position and understanding what they went through will help tie the lessons that you learned that day a little bit more effectively into your brain. But also as a pilgrim, it offers an opportunity to do the same thing that they did when they came before you. And as I talked about too, a little bit with the lighter diary, like he references doing the same things, going to the same street corners, going to the same positions. So the idea that we're continuing this practice by kind of setting the same patterns and going to the same places and touching the same elements really ties you into the experience of those who came before you.
You had the opportunity to explore this a bit more in a chapter that you wrote for a book that is forthcoming, which I co-edited with my colleagues in France, Stéphane Michonneau and Franck Viltart. The title of your chapter is When the Last Man is Gone. And I asked if you would give us a presentation for this episode on your chapter. It's really well done. It was a part of, it's a particular set of pilgrimages that really, I think, highlights the importance of pilgrimages for the veterans of the First World War, but also for specific people in Pennsylvania who have ties to this town in France, these two towns, Fismes and Fismette. And so it would be wonderful to hear you talk about your chapter and to see your presentation.
Sure. I'm happy to share it with you. So the image here to kind of start this with, this is a street corner in Fismes itself. And this photo was taken almost immediately after the war. The two individuals that you see pictured here are members of the 32nd Division, which was drawn from Wisconsin and Michigan. And they are back going through the towns of Fismes and Fismette in literally the months after the fighting has ended. This division was on occupation duty, and they had the opportunity to tour through France and see some of the areas that they had previously fought. So really, we're talking weeks, months after the end of the war. These trips of pilgrimage are already beginning. So for your listeners who may not be have such a strong affinity for the National Guard and Army history as I have, I'll delve a little bit, who these soldiers are that we're talking about. So the National Guard reserve component of the Army, this is the state-based element of the Army. Each of the 54 states and territories in the United States has their own National Guard. And in Pennsylvania, it's a pretty historic organization. Some of these units date all the way back to the 1740s. They predate the United States itself. So there's a strong connection in these organizations to their history and where they come from, but there's also a big connection to the community. So unlike regular Army soldiers, National Guardsmen are recruited in a community. They serve locally. Many of these soldiers in their career will, 6-7 years in the National Guard, will never leave their community. They'll be there for service to train as a reserve for the Army in case of time of war. They'll respond to things like floods, civil disturbance, snowstorms. Recently has been happening a lot. But they're small units, 100 men or less, and many of them have very important professions within the town. They're the teachers, the lawyers, the government officials. They are the people who make the town run. So these are not just military units, they are very much community organizations. And when one of these units goes off to war, the community goes with it in spirit. Newspapers are littered with accounts of our boys over there. What is our company doing? What are our boys doing in France? So there is a strong tie to the individual experience back home the entire time these soldiers are deployed. So you can see from the images, we're looking specifically at here a unit from the town of Meadville, which will play a big role in the pilgrimage process. They're organized first in 1870, so by the time they ship off to World War I, they've got a pretty strong connection to their community. They've been there quite some time, so they're tied in very well. The fighting in France, it varies from campaign to campaign. I think a lot of historians think, or a lot of the public too, think that, trenches, trench warfare, the rats, the gas, this is what World War I was like. And the American experience can be very different, not just in an overall sense, but literally from town to town, from campaign to campaign in the war. The Pennsylvania Division, the 28th Division, as it becomes known during the war, fights really from July of 1918 all the way through November. They're in most of the major campaigns of the AEF. They're one of the earliest divisions into the fight, and they'll fight from the banks of the Marne River across France and into the Argonne, even into the closing days of the war in the Saint-Mihiel sector. So they see many different types of fights. Really, I think what struck me about the fighting on the Velle and Fismes and Fismette is if you look at a larger history of World War I, very seldom will you find much time devoted to the fighting on the Velle. For the American Expeditionary Force as a whole, this is not a significant fight. This is a supporting operation, as we call it in modern military parlance. There's major events going on elsewhere, and this fight here serves a purpose in the wider campaign, but it's not the focal point of what's going on at the time. But if you're a soldier from Pennsylvania and you're trapped on the banks of the Velle for 30 days under, 77 fire and machine gun fire, being gassed even in your reserve and rest positions, for that month, this is the worst part of the war. And that's very much what comes through in the memory of these soldiers in their memoirs and their stories back home in the newspaper. They very much talk about how horrible this period of time was and how impactful the fighting in Fismes and Fismette was to them as individuals and as an organization that's learning in combat. More soldiers from the town of Meadville fell in this portion of the fighting, than the rest of the war. And for many of the members of these units that fought here, this was sacred ground. I think one of the things too that I uncovered kind of later on is that from a mental health perspective, the experience with combat stress and shell shock, as we call it today, was at a heightened point during this fighting in Meadville. They really had frontline positions and reserve positions that were clocked in by the Germans. So there was no rest during that time. You were just as likely to be gassed in your reserve position or to come under fire in your reserve area as you were on the front lines. So it's a very difficult time for them. As we mentioned, though, this pilgrimage practice starts in 1919. I know with your studies, you've seen a lot of this, but as we're demobilizing, preparing to send people back home, Joe is going to be Joe, as we say in the Army, and they're going to get up to no good if we don't keep them busy. So one of the things that the AEF starts to do is it starts to plan these little trips around France to let soldiers see things. They often reference going to see the statue of Joan of Arc, or going to the remains of the cathedral in Reims, or going back to Paris and seeing whatever it is they wanted to see in Paris. But you see also several mentions of groups like the gentleman we saw in that first photo returning to the battlefields they fought and seeing the ground that they fought on. In fact, there's also groups that travel back to see if they can recover casualties and identify where their friends were buried in some of these fights. But that really progresses. The Army starts in 1921, 22, I can't recall exactly which year, but they begin almost kind of the staff ride process that I participate in today by taking students from the U.S. Military Academy at West Point over to France to study the battles there. So they walk through these places, and you see many pictures of Fismes and Fismette, which the Army uses as a lesson in failure for its future soldiers. At the time, the Army considered this to be an unsuccessful operation, and that the losses were tremendous, and that there was much we could learn from to prevent something like this happening. And then again, there's other groups that are coming back for different purposes. As you and Alison Finkelstein have studied pretty extensively, the Gold Star Mothers begin making their trips back in this time, and they travel alongside with military escorts, and they visit these locations. So while all this is going on, many in the United States and Pennsylvania specifically are saying, hey, we want to make a trip back. We want to commemorate the sacrifices we've made. We want to see the grounds again, and we want to pay respects to our brothers that we left behind there. And Pennsylvania takes a rather unique approach, and they establish a state commission, the Pennsylvania State Battle Monuments Commission, which is unique. I don't know that any other state had something as prolific as this, funding from the taxpayers to erect monuments across France. And they make a decision very early on that one of the major places to be commemorated will be Fismes and Fismette. I think there's some thought that nobody else will do it if it's not Pennsylvanians. So this is very important to them. So in 1926, the work begins, and it's done in 1928. And Pennsylvania took an interesting approach with this. There's very much an attempt to make not just memorials, but public spaces that the French can use. So we don't want to just put a giant granite monolith up somewhere that says Pennsylvanians were here, as we had done in the Civil War with all of our battles. But here in France, we want to establish community spaces where the French can live among the reminder that Pennsylvanians had been there. So in Fismes and Fismette, the fighting over the bridgehead was the real focal point of the fighting for the Americans. So they established the bridge itself as this reminder. So to kind of cap off this Battle Monuments Commission effort, the Pennsylvania Battle Monuments Commission creates a group of just over 200 Pennsylvania soldiers who travel to France on what they call the Pennsylvania Pilgrimage. And they move from site to site, dedicating monuments, visiting the fallen, and paying their respects. And there's a quote here, and I have it at the bottom of this slide, by veteran James Miron, who fought with the 112th Infantry in France. And he says that it was a different pilgrimage today, for there was no terror in it. The trip was by motor, not with 70-pound packs and double ammunition, rain-soaked clothes bearing down heavily. The route of honor today was rich in memory. So for these soldiers, this offered an opportunity for both veterans and new soldiers in the unit to share together the experience of commemoration and remembrance. After this experience, and this is such a tremendous trip, it's covered in every newspaper in Pennsylvania, and there's many things that come of it. But when the veterans return, there's this concern that maybe that'll be the end of it. So we have to find a way to continue this connection. So in Meadville, where these soldiers had so horribly experienced the fight in Fismes and Fismette, they established a society de Fismes, or the Last Man Club, as they called it at one point. And they used this community organization to remember the experience at Fismes and Fismette and to pass on this kind of connection to the town. They start a correspondence between Fismes and Meadville, which continues on for many years. Messages back and forth between the towns, sending letters, sending groups of visitors, pilgrims from one town to the other. And then, a Second World War breaks out. And Fismes itself, which if you travel to Robin and Laurence Museum, you will see played a pivotal role in the 1940 invasion of France. The bridge itself, the Pennsylvania Memorial Bridge, is actually blown in a defensive action by the French army to prevent the Germans from crossing the Velle River. So very much repeating the horrors of the fighting in the First World War in Fismes itself. And the town is brutalized. It's under German occupation. There's a significant resistance movement in the town, and it's very, very much destroyed again. And these members of the Last Man Club, the Society de Fismes, they take up collection. They draw attention to this, and they raise millions of francs and bring food and clothing and things like that they ship over in 1947 to kind of tie in this connection. But as these veterans start to fade away, they're worried that maybe this won't continue, and they try to take other groups back. They team up with World War II veterans, and they travel over to France, and they kind of share a pilgrimage with both World War I and World War II veterans of the division. And later they host different groups and continue this connection until really the last men from this club pass away in 1995. And there are elements of it, I think, that are pretty important. We kind of alluded to this before. One of the ways they try and preserve this memory, as you see on the screen here, this is the crest of the 112th Infantry. So every soldier in that regiment will wear this on their uniform. And featured right there in the center of the crest is the bridge itself at Fismes and Fismette. One of the most important experiences, I think, for me personally on our pilgrimage to France was having a soldier standing on the bridge realize for the first time that he was at the place that he'd worn on his uniform every day since he enlisted. I think one of the most intriguing pieces, though, of this story is how the pilgrimage practice and the memory is carried on since the war. So there are three distinct groups, I think, that help carry on this practice, and they are not who I would have expected when I started this research. So we see many connections between the towns of Fismes and Meadville themselves. We see a military connection. This is where my personal experience came in. But we also see a connection with students in a university, Allegheny College, which is in the Meadville area. So the town takes up the torch, and after many years of kind of this lapsed connection between the two, they prepare for a big push again in the centennial in 2014. They begin planning and set up commemorations in 2018. Government officials exchange from town to town. They travel back and forth. They speak about the connection. They encourage people to understand its importance. And in 2018, a delegation of Meadville residents, town officials, and descendants of veterans travel to France to kind of reinvigorate this connection. And in the years after that, members of the Fismois community have traveled over to Meadville and continued visiting back and forth and carrying on this connection. As we talked about a bit with the staff ride program, we've been able to take soldiers over. This began in 2014 before I was involved with the now Lieutenant Colonel Jason Hoffman, who was in France and a captain in B Company of the 112th Infantry when he fought in Iraq. So he was familiar with this connection and helped take soldiers there for the first time in 2014. Later, we were able to take a trip in 2018. And again, when I came in 2019, which really traced the same route that the Pennsylvania Battle Monuments Commission did in 1928. And then the last group, really, I think that's one of the most intriguing, is this connection of student communities between the two. Allegheny College in 2015 began a pilgrimage internship type connection where students would travel to Theme from Meadville. They would have an internship in the town, mostly dealing with translating documents and understanding the connection between the two towns, making it more accessible for the people of Theme to read about the connection and learn about it. And then back in Meadville, they would work on the same sort of work, translating documents that the city hall had from this connection and making it more accessible to the people of Meadville. They had time during these exchanges to tour the battlefields to learn about the connection, and several members of the community in Theme took an active role in kind of stewarding this, which you see, I think, in a little bit more detail than I could get into today in the book chapter that we spoke about. But many of these individuals who I spoke to have continued the connection with Theme long after. So they are still in contact with the people from the town through Facebook and Instagram, and they stay in touch. In the last several years, though, with the end of the centennial, there was some concern that this would fall away and that all these efforts would again kind of go dark. But there have been several groups who have continued pushing this. So the ABMC and many of the folks, Hubert Kalud, who worked at the Voisin Cemetery, who's now elsewhere in the ABMC system, he definitely facilitated this a lot with bringing soldiers, civilians, and other groups to Voisin and taking them to Theme and talking to them about that connection. And then, as we talked about, Robin and Laurent in the Musée 40 France Vehicular, who spent a lot of time facilitating a lot of these interactions, teaching soldiers when they came on staff rides, and even going as far as helping descendant families locate where their family had served. Robin escorted the family of Captain Lynch, who was killed in action in Theme, to the exact location where he was killed during fighting. So they've taken not just a connection as a museum who's trying to interpret the past, but they've also taken a personal role with many of these families. So really, one of the other things that I thought was quite unique with this experience was the physical elements of it. You talked about earlier the stone wall and the physical connections to elements of the town. One thing that really struck me is how many groups of pilgrims, both today and back then, connect the water and the earth in Theme with the experience. In 1934, one of the veterans of the battle requested seeds from poppies in Theme so that he could sow them in the earth here in Pennsylvania. Many of these were planted at Boalsburg, the Pennsylvania memorial to the 28th Division out towards State College. Others were sown on the graves of veterans of Fismes and Fismette here in Pennsylvania, but we still see that practice with me carrying the poppy back today. In 2018 and 2019, water from French Creek in Meadville and the Velle River itself were exchanged ceremonially by members of the town and pilgrims traveling back and forth. And even as recently as my last trip to Theme last year, I carried a tin of earth back to the family of a soldier who fell in the fighting there. So they had asked specifically for me to bring that back, so I brought it with me on the last trip. So this practice has continued from generation to generation. So, hopefully this is something that continues. We're in an increasingly digital world, which sometimes will draw us away from the physical aspects of pilgrimage, but at the same time, it's ensured that this connection is continued. It's much easier for me to access Robin whenever I feel like it and say, hey, what does this street corner look like today? Or, hey, is this still there? And we can share our research and our work together pretty easily. So this has been something that has concerned me. Will it continue? But it seems like these communities are very strongly moving forward with this connection and hoping that 2028 brings yet another commemoration of the 100 years since the Pennsylvania Battle Monuments Commission. But just as we kind of close this, one of the things that struck me visually the first time I was in Fismette, as you can see in this image, just a house, random resident of Fismette flying the Pennsylvania state flag next to the French flag. And I did not know about this. I rounded a corner and saw it and literally took my breath away for a minute to think that somebody in this small town cared enough about that connection to go out and find a Pennsylvania flag and fly it. So hopefully that wasn't too long-winded, but that is what we spoke about when I last saw you in France.
Thank you so much. The presentation, the photos were wonderful, and the information also was was enlightening, and I jotted down a number of notes that I wanted to follow up with you about after you were finished. I have some specific questions about the state of Pennsylvania that we can get into. I'm sort of just springing them on you now, but this bumps very much into my work in the village of Bellow and Bellow Wood. The state of Pennsylvania was integral to the American memory in the early years of negotiating how American memory of the war would be sort of concretized in the area. And during the era when there was a strong focus on rebuilding the buildings within the village, there was an idea that the buildings themselves would become living memorials. And the first water well that was paid for by the Bellawood Memorial Association is dedicated to the soldiers of Pennsylvania, and it is affectionately called the Pennsylvania Fountain. And I'm curious about this living memorials tradition within the state of Pennsylvania, and if it has a particular origin. You referenced the Civil War and the monuments of the Civil War, and I wondered if their ideas stemmed from that, or if there is another tradition that is drawn from that may be unique to the state of Pennsylvania.
Yeah, that is definitely a very interesting connection. I have done a bit of digging into this with the more recent work I'm doing on the wider Pennsylvania pilgrimage. The piece we talked about with Fismes and Fismette is one of only 5 major stops that they make on that trip. There's so much more to delve into, but in each of those 5 memorials, they pushed very much for a usable memorial: fountains, a bridge, a community center, a park, which really isn't a park, but in theory it was. But they pushed very much with this World War I trip to give something to the French people that they could use. And when we look at Civil War memory, I think in Pennsylvania at least, and I made a joke earlier, granite monolith. This is something that a friend of ours, a colleague, has always joked that Pennsylvania shows up to the battlefield and puts the biggest, most elaborate thing they could find during the Civil War. And it's very true. Every major fighting occasion that Pennsylvania is involved in, they put something large and almost obnoxious on Gettysburg, Antietam, even the smaller locations where they had less troops at, like Monocacy. There's large Pennsylvania memorials. So there's always something like that. But I think there is a very different feeling when it came to World War One. The Civil War for Pennsylvanians was fought, with the exception of Gettysburg, not on our home turf. So we saw the Confederates as rebels, and the loss of their property and the destruction of their cities did not strike the same chord with us that the destruction of France, the victims in the mind of many AEF soldiers, the French towns, the people that cooked them eggs or brought them water or feted their arrival, they were victims. And when the Pennsylvanians moved through these towns, they saw the destitution that was caused by the war. And I think there was a very distinct push in World War I to try and come up with ways to help the French and recover. And you see this across France. I don't think it's uniquely a Pennsylvanian thing. There's the Carnegie libraries that are established in places like Worms. There's collection efforts that are taken up to rebuild these cities and towns across. But in the papers of the Pennsylvania Battle Monuments Commission, it is a very distinct push that these will not just be reminders that Pennsylvania was there. They will be usable to the people.
Did they, at the time of the early writings about this, do they call them living memorials, or is that something that gets labeled over top of what's already going on?
So I'm not sure that I've seen that word used before. I'm trying to remember. Paul Philippe Cray writes in some of his discussions with the state of Pennsylvania, and he's a unique individual as well. He teaches in Pennsylvania and Philadelphia. He's a French veteran of the war, and he does all of these monuments and memorials. So he's got a really odd connection to the Pennsylvania Battle Monuments Commission. But he writes specifically that these will have purpose, I believe is the word that he uses. And so, while he may not call it a living memorial, I think the attempt was to to capture something that could both be a reminder but be functional.
And maybe it is exactly a reaction to these giant monuments that were erected after the Civil War, where there is kind of a backlash. And I mean, this is just conjecture because I haven't seen any evidence of that, but it does seem interesting that in one setting, which would have been the grandparents, the grandfathers of these soldiers, these monuments were imposing and giant. And then in the conflict that we see several decades later, there's a focus on something usable, something that is ongoing, something that can be engaged with by the local people.
I think there's definitely a very different way of remembering the war. Yes, the AEF veterans were victorious over the Germans, and there's this down with the Kaiser attitude. But when you look at the Civil War memory, and it's something that a lot of people I think are delving into a bit more now than has been done in the past, but especially within the GAR in Pennsylvania, there's this idea that we put down the rebellion, we defeated the enemy here on our own turf, and we were victorious. And so, this is a pride in our victory, and this is an attempt to remind the rebels of our sacrifice. When you look at Gettysburg, and I'm not a scholar of the monuments and memory in the Civil War, but there's definitely a lot of work been done that shows that like the air of victory and overcoming the rebellion is important to the GAR and these men as they erect the monuments. Whereas we look to France, and I think there's a bit more of a sorrow in the experience and not just the victory. Well, that does play a part too.
The word that you just used, sorrow, has reminded me about something we were talking a bit about before we started recording, which is the Knights of Columbus pilgrimage that occurred in 1920. The group did stop at Fismes and Fismette, and the author of this particular account, Patrick H. Kelly, talks about the scene that they encountered in Fismes. And he talks about the vast destruction. He mentions that there were 600 houses that formerly stood in the area. But they also talk about seeing the people and what is happening with the people. And he says, during all our travels, we experienced a feeling of sorrow in beholding the great number of widows dressed in black and the sad-faced orphans being cared for by the good sisters of charity. This feature brought a touch of melancholy to the trip almost hourly. It is a common scene as we stop at some historic point to see the tears streaming from the eyes of the women who have gathered to welcome us, our presence being a reminder of the sufferings and loss they endured. He then goes on to talk about the 1,800 Americans who lost their lives there, and then also makes mention of the loss of trees. So he's noting the human destruction, the sorrow that they see on the faces of the French locals, but then also talks about the destruction of trees, which I think is interesting, that in this entire account, just focus here, this segment on Fismes, that he addresses this loss of the environment, the natural environment, as unnecessary. And I wonder how this then plays into the pilgrimages and the focus on this rebirth, the rebirth of poppies, the soil that has been the scene of destruction, and the soil which has been made sacred. It's been consecrated by the blood of soldiers, and the importance of these natural features in connecting the pilgrims from the U.S. And other places, but we're talking about American pilgrims right now, and how these natural features, it's so fascinating to me how these tangible natural features really rise to the fore of being so important in the pilgrimage practices, in connecting one place to the other.
Yeah, truly is, I think, a unique characteristic of this. That one of the things that struck me with every account, Mirren's account, when he kind of writes a serial for the newspapers with the Does returning to France, and he writes all these little stories about the trip. But then also in Leiter's diary, and even some one-off accounts that you read from time to time, this idea that you can barely recognize the town in the area along the Vel because it is reborn again, rebuilt, reborn. There's this note, like in an American Legion article too, the idea of traveling through Fismes and seeing civilians is shocking to these people, because one of the things we kind of gloss over, I think, as military historians, is that there were people whose entire life was in these towns. And while it may have been the bunker, command post for headquarters company of the 112th Infantry, that was the basement of somebody's house. And all of those chairs and the detritus of war that were around these soldiers that forged their memory, that was something that belonged to these people, that was at one point part of an everyday peaceful life that has now been shattered, destroyed, and removed. And so when they come back and they see these people returning to their homes, they see the poppies growing, they see the trees along the Vel River that they had felled, to cross in some of the most harrowing moments of their life. There's a big piece of the story of the fighting on the Vel, using the trees and felling them as temporary bridges, because it was so, heavy fire that they couldn't build a normal bridge to cross the river. They would literally just cut trees and push them into the water and then run across them. So this is something that I think a lot of the veterans returning are taken aback by how much has been done in 10 years, or, in some cases in a year or 2 years, to reclaim this ground.
It is a consistent theme amongst the pilgrimages that happened during the interwar era, with pilgrims remarking on seeing a child with a smile on her face, or seeing buildings that are reconstructed, or seeing French people return to some semblance of their lives before the war and the destruction. It's a really important part of, I think, creating meaning of their wartime experiences, is seeing that the experience and the sacrifice was quote unquote worth it, that there was some outcome that resulted from this war, other than chaos, destruction, loss of life, post-traumatic stress disorder, or shell shock as it was known at that point. So it is important to see the contrast, I think, for these veterans, for them to return and see that life has gone on and that it is in some way flourishing again.
Yeah, absolutely. Americans have this deep connection with the French as our first ally, the people that helped us win our own revolution, Lafayette and Somme-CC, like all of this connection to this relationship. It really, I think you see that in their love of the French people in the AEF. Americans come through and they view the French as victims, and you see, hundreds of photos in the Signal Corps photo collection of, giving food to French civilians, or sitting with the French orphans, or even the adopting of French children, which continues even on the 1928 pilgrimage of Pennsylvanians. There is a case of adopting a French child take place.
You mentioned that in the West Point pilgrimages and some of the early, I should say, staff rides, I don't think they were calling them pilgrimages at this point. We can look back and say there were probably pilgrimage aspects, but they are very squarely in the staff ride camp here. And they're studying, as particularly Fismes, as a massive failure. How does that impact the soldiers who fought there? Do you think that they're in some way, does this motivate them to go on the pilgrimage, or in what ways does this motivate them? And is there a wider discourse? Is this information about the Army viewing this as a failure? Does that sort of trickle down to the average soldier, average veteran at this point?
So this is one that as I study more and more the papers of different commanders in the junior leaders in the 28th Division who rise after the war into higher ranks in the Pennsylvania National Guard, become, generals or colonels later on, but were young lieutenants or sergeants during the fight at Fismes and Fismette. There is this view, especially looking specifically at their corps commander, Ballard, and thinking that they were misused in this fight. And I think the idea that it was a failure is something that upsets many of them, but it doesn't really color too much their personal opinions, because I think many, especially in the National Guard community, when it comes to veterans of World War One, view this kind of us versus them with the regular army, and that the regular army leadership failed the National Guardsmen, and then the regular army viewpoint is that the National Guardsmen, failed in what they were asked to do. Oftentimes. So there is some give and take. Obviously, they are very proud of what they did together. They will write good things. Ballard calls the 28th Division his shock division at one point. But he also, in his memoirs, writes about them failing at this portion on the Belle. He lays the blame on the French and not the Americans, but he talks about this failure. And you see that also in the historiography for many years after. There is a very brilliant World War I author, Ed Langell, who writes about, quote, the tragedy at Fismette. And that struck me as a 28th Division soldier, because I always thought this was this glorious victory, and why are we calling it a tragedy? And it got me a little incensed many years later, and I was not even in the battle. But you see that among the veterans as well. I think one of the things that really drives them to tie in with Fismes and Fismette and to commemorate it is the thought that the Army does not care about this. And if we don't do it, nobody else will. And this is important to us as a community.
And this is the case, isn't it, for many of the National Guard divisions, that the divisions themselves are the ones that are erecting monuments and memorials, and then there are associated pilgrimages with these units that are specific to. And one of the primary characteristics is the fact that they are National Guard divisions.
Yes, I know you've done extensive work on the YD pilgrimage and all of the things that goes on with the New England troops, but you see a very similar one. Josh Mann, a historian for the Ohio National Guard, uncovered a photo album and some notes from 37th Division conducting their own Ohio pilgrimage. One of the most unique things I found in that collection that he passed along was that they actually stopped members of the all-white 37th Division from Ohio, stopped at the memorial to the 372nd, which was where the regiment in which the African-American National Guardsmen from Ohio served. So even though they served in different divisions, in different corps, in different theaters of the war, really, these guardsmen knew that, even despite the racial barrier between their two groups, these were other guardsmen, and they took time to distinctly visit their memorial. So you do see a bit of this guard connection with the pilgrimages that I think comes in part from just a community. 1st Division, 5th Division, they did their own events as well, even though they are a regular Army division. But there's definitely a deeper community connection in the Guard, because when they go home, they all go back home to the same community, whereas the regular Army scatters to the winds after the war. The veterans of the regular Army, rather.
I'm curious about your thoughts around shell shock and about the mental health and or psychological toll on the soldiers that were fighting in Fismes and Fismette, and what parallels you have drawn, if any, between the type of close combat kind of house-to-house fighting in Fismes and Fismette and what has happened during the global war on terror.
Yeah, I think there are some connections here. One of the things that always interested me in Fismes and Fismette to begin with is that it was very much not what you pictured when you thought World War One. Living underground in the basements of the houses, barricading street corners, shots being fired from rooftops and upstairs windows. Like, this is not what I expected when I read about World War One. So, there were definitely some parallels to the street fighting that you saw in places like, Iraq. But I think one of the things that kind of struck me, and I've always thought, and this could be maybe an unpopular opinion, but the AEF generation has a lot in common, I think, with the modern GWAT or Global War on Terror generation. Our experiences, in these brief year-long type deployments, right? Like the AEF fights for less than a year in combat, and then they come back home. And in the GWAT, many of our deployments were 9 months to 13, 14 months. So very similar short period of time to be in war and then be back in society. Unlike the World War II generation, who many went over in 43 and didn't return till 45, 46. So it's a little bit of a different experience, I think. This idea of community organizations, the National Guard and the Army Reserve play a huge role in global war on terror. Deploying as community organizations where you see towns losing 5, 6 people in an IED, something that is not as common in the World War II generation, I think, or Vietnam or Korea. So there is definitely an interesting connection with the experience and the type of fighting that you see there. And I think the thought of, experiencing the trauma of what it would have been like to be in Fismes and Fismette and seeing the destruction, the death, coming back and seeing it replaced with this life and these families and these people and being repaired does a lot for these veterans. And I think it plays a lot into, specifically when you look at Meadville and the Society de Fismes, like their just ever-present connection with the town. I think that plays a huge role, the fact that they were able to see it rebuilt and feel maybe that what they went through was justified for that reason.
It's highly unlikely that GWAT veterans are going to be going to Iraq or Afghanistan or other places where they have engaged in combat operations. And I'm curious about your thoughts regarding how retracing the pilgrimages of the interwar era in particular may contribute to making meaning of the GWAT experiences for veterans, and or could contribute to some type of kind of increased mental health and well-being for veterans who they have this traumatic experiences. They're not going on pilgrimages to see the villages or the areas rebuilt where they served. Is there the experience of a pilgrimage to the Western Front now, or a staff ride infused with pilgrimage practices to the Western Front of the First World War? Is there some type of utility or particular meaning making that can occur for GWAT veterans in the context of this geography of World War I?
It's certainly a tough one. I'd like to think to your first point, I'd like to think that there could be a time, that GWAT veterans would be able to go back and see some of these places. I even recall briefly during the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq that they brought back, due to the length of the conflict, they brought back veterans who had been wounded early on as part of a special program, and I can send you some of the details of that later on, brought them back to the areas in which they fought to visit with troops that were there. So some things like that could occur, I think, maybe in the future. You never know how things will shake out. So maybe there's a hope that could be something down the road. But I think, to me, the thing that always struck me with the military community is that you join a tradition of an organization. I've traveled all over visiting sites related to the unit that I fought with. And that was my unit in Iraq, but it was also my unit when it was at Princeton in 1776, and when it was at Gettysburg in 1863. I'll probably never get out to Peleliu where they fought in 45, but it was a unit that served many different eras with many different groups of people like me. So the idea that you're part of an organization that is kind of ever living is very unique. And I think that was one of the big reasons that the Army put money into the program that I was on for so long at the National Guard Bureau, is that they saw the benefit of this in 2018. The pride that soldiers took from seeing their unit insignia emblazoned on a monument somewhere, the experience of seeing a grateful French population, even 100 years later, that still remembered the soldiers being there, I think there was something mentally for those soldiers who were there, is thinking, I'm part of this. My piece looked different. My piece in the GWAT was very different, but it's part of this much larger story, and there's a lot you can take from that.
In some ways, there are parallels between the focus on living memorials in the 1920s and some into the 1930s, particularly with Pennsylvania, and living memorials in various villages in France. And the legacy of that is that you all are the living memorial. You are the living stones that connect this long history of soldiers to a particular place. And so where you go, that is the living memorial, because you still exist.
Yeah, I think that's always been a big part for me. Like, I've been, by doing the research and learning about the past of the division, it kind of, in me, is a fire to make sure that people remember this and understand this, because as we kind of talked to, why is this practice between Fismes and Pennsylvania continued? It's because it keeps being born in another generation after another generation. So if you are the torchbearer, you have to do everything during your time to make sure that it doesn't go out and that the next generation remembers it. So, this has driven me to get involved with the 28th Division Association, and to kind of, in a way, driven me into a career as a historian for the Army. So, this type of importance of being part of the community and keeping the practice and the memory going, I think can really drive people who necessarily didn't experience the fighting that they're learning about or commemorate.
I have a final question for you that is related to your wide and warm embrace of pilgrimages, which, as I understand it, has emerged recently. And I'd like to hear how the concept of pilgrimage, the specificity of pilgrimage practices that you have spoken about in the presentation today, but also in your chapter, how has that changed your perspective on the historical research that you're doing and on your view of war and memory broadly?
Yeah, so I would say that my interest in pilgrimages is shocking to me. I would consider myself a very traditional military historian when it comes to it. I was a soldier. I was in the Army, wanted to learn about battles and warfare and leaders and medals and campaigns and all of those things. And that's what I focused on for so long. And I think what really struck me with this process, and in part working with you a bit early on, was that I was part of this inadvertently. I had never set out to be a pilgrim. I had never set out to involve myself in the pilgrimage process and the memory of it. And I think that kind of shocking realization that I involuntarily was drawn into it really intrigued me. And then I think something that I've talked with other veterans about too is the fact that it's this sense of a little bit of purpose when your time in uniform is done, and that these soldiers, they looked for a way when they were no longer shouldering a rifle or wearing that uniform with the keystone on it. How do they stay connected to the experiences and the soldiers of that division as it moved forward? Another thing I think that really kind of drove me into this is I served in Iraq in 2009, and it wasn't until 2019 that I really started thinking about my experience and kind of grappling with some of the things that went on. And it struck me that it was 10 years, like almost on the dot, when I started kind of having thoughts about that and experiencing that among my peers too, learning that was about the time that everybody started sending out the, hey, how are you doing? What are you doing? type messages, and let's reconnect, let's get together. All that type of stuff was happening at the same time, the 10-year mark. And then looking at the pilgrimage here, the Pennsylvania pilgrimage, it's 10 years after. That's when they decided, like, we need to do something, we need to get out there. And that really connected it on a personal level with me in a way that I did not expect or initially look at. kind of the similar mindset of veteran pilgrims of World War I to what my own community was experiencing with the GWOT. So I think as somebody who thought they would always focus on battles and warfare and bayonets and explosions, delving into the way that the veterans of the fight dealt with their experience after the war. I know in particular, there is one veteran who his name is on every account of the fighting in Fismette, a guy by the name of Miller, who every veteran who fought there talks about his bravery, his ability. He was the one really that held them together in Fismette. He was the one in charge, even though he was just a captain. And then to see that after the war, he was not as successful with dealing with his experiences. And, this person who in the heat of the moment, in the heat of the fighting, was the pinnacle of a soldier. And then when you start to learn about remembrance and war and memory, you see how hard it was for him to bear those experiences after the war and how it changed who he was. So that kind of opened up this door to me of, it's great to understand the fighting and all the things that take place and how the Army advanced forward, the tip of a bayonet, but what do we do afterwards as soldiers to keep moving on? And I think that really drew me into the pilgrimage studies.
Is there something particular about the word? We could be talking about veterans going on trips, or we've talked about staff rides, or there's the concept of battlefield tour. There's probably many iterations of ways of describing when a person visits a battlefield. And my question is around the word itself. What does the word give us or give you permission to do, or how does it open the aperture of thinking about how to look holistically about war and the aftermath of war?
This is actually one I grappled with a lot, because when I first started doing this work, using the word pilgrimage seemed very unfamiliar, uncomfortable a little bit. I always had made such a point during my career, a staff ride is a training event. That is what it is. Like, don't describe it as a tour. Don't describe it as anything else. It is a training event. We're here to learn. We're here to make ourselves better soldiers. But as you kind of see when you delve into this stuff, and as I kind of got into in my chapter, is that while that is taking place, and that is the primary goal of the staff ride events, the practices of the staff ride often align with what experiences of people on a traditional pilgrimage. Like, we planned a series of stops to learn a progressive lesson about soldiers moving forward in battle, and when they went back to remember their experience, they used those same stops 100 years before we got there. So it was unique that it came across that way to me, and like I said, I struggled using it a lot. The first draft of my chapter, I had to force myself to put it in a lot. And then I kind of became more comfortable with it, because so many of the aspects of pilgrimage are things that are familiar to soldiers, right? Like the obsession with these artifacts, right? Like every soldier has the things that they brought back, the things that they carried with them that tie them to that experience, just as pilgrims do. The symbolism of our heraldry and our crests, and the piece of the battle that you wear every day, even though you never fought there, is important to a soldier. Those symbols become so important, just like they do for pilgrims. And the practice of going to these places to commune with those who came before you is so important in pilgrimage, across the spectrum, from civilians to religious to different social organizations. But for soldiers, we do that all the time. We go to battlefields to pay respects to those who fought like us. So I think using the word pilgrimage was a challenge for me at first, and the more and more I worked on this project, the more and more it became natural and easier for me to understand and relate to.
Been grappling similarly with the concept. I mean, obviously, I'm approaching this from a pilgrimage paradigm and a pilgrimage framework, and I'm also cautious to not overlay pilgrimages over top of every type of activity that is occurring at a battlefield. I think that's also imprudent and does not take into account the varied experiences and intents and motivations for these visits, tours, staff rides. And over the past week, I have landed on this idea that battlefield pilgrimages are they're imbued with a consecrated motive. So, or that consecration is occurring, and the battlefield itself has been characterized as consecrated by blood. James Harvard talked about this actually in his 1923 speech in Bella Wood, that the earth itself was consecrated by the blood. But then he went on to say that it would be consecrated by the tears of mothers. And so for me, this is the differentiating characteristic, is that some type of consecration either must occur or has occurred, and that is what the pilgrimage is tied to, more than an educational trip, which pilgrimages are educational. There's always something educational that happens, but I do think this concept of consecration, whether that is in our selves, so it's an internal consecration where we are seeing a particular battlefield as sacred, or it has been consecrated by the tears of mothers or the tears of families, or those who have gone before us have also played a role in this consecration. So from now on, that's how I'm kind of going to tease apart the different motivations, is I'm going to consider whether some level of consecration, and I use that term loosely, not based in sort of a Catholic understanding of consecration, but there is something that must happen mentally for this ground and this area and the people to have been consecrated. And that can either stem from within ourselves, or it can happen through, in many cases, there's been religious consecration that has occurred also.
I think that's an excellent way of looking at it. And while you were talking, I reached out and grabbed something. So I have the pamphlet given to members of the trip, and to me, the use of the word pilgrimage for the Pennsylvania Battle Monuments Commission trip is tied very much to what you're talking about. You consecrating the ground, the monuments, and the memorials, going together to do that as a process is what made that a pilgrimage and not anything else. So I think that's a wonderful way of looking at it.
Thank you so much for being on Psychology of Pilgrimage. It's been a blast to spend time talking to you about your knowledge of the Keystone Division, the 1928 pilgrimage, the ongoing pilgrimages and relationship between Meadville and Fismes and Fismette. And it's really exciting to see you thriving in this new area of your own scholarship related to pilgrimages. And I think that it's going to be wonderful to see how that progresses for you.
Thank you so much for having me here today. It's been an absolute pleasure, and I really, thank you for encouraging me to explore this type of scholarship, which was uncomfortable to me at first, but has definitely become very, very important to me. One thing, if I could, before we go, I just wanted to share a quick photo with you based on something we talked about earlier. So as I was preparing for the podcast, selecting my artifact, I picked this poppy, and yesterday I had gone back to transcribing this diary of Sergeant Leiter. And as I scrolled through the pages, I came to the last page, and it just struck me, the practices 100 years apart are very similar. That shared experience, two people who never lived at the same time doing the exact same thing in the same place.
Thank you for sharing this. It's beautiful. It encompasses pilgrimage, I think, perfectly in the practice of collecting the poppy, the two people being in the same place, separated by distance, both soldiers, both on a pilgrimage, and it's beautiful. Thank you.